Our next speaker comes to us from Cardiff University, from the School of History and Archaeology, Paul Nicholson, and he's going to be asking the question, could the Egyptians make glass? An integrated approach to experimental archaeology.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Good. Well, glass is a complex material. I think it's well summed up here by Bill Bryson, who says that among the many thousands of things I've never been able to understand, one in particular stands out. That is the question of who was the first person who stood by a pile of sand and said, you know, I bet if we took some of this and mixed it with a little potash and heated it, we could make a material that would be solid and yet transparent. We could call it glass. Call me obtuse, but you could stand me on a beach until the end of time, and never would it occur to me to try to make it into windows. I'm not going to be able to tell you today who the man who stood in front of the pile of sand was, but I would like to try to give some indication of perhaps whether the ancient Egyptians themselves possessed the technology to make glass from its raw materials rather than simply work glass. And it's an important distinction because the technology needed to make glass from its raw materials is much more complex than simply taking a pre-prepared piece of glass made perhaps in another culture and melting it and working it into an object. So I'm not looking at all at how the Egyptians made vessels here, but how they may have been able to make the raw material glass from which vessels would ultimately be made. There are no ancient Egyptian accounts that we know of so far about how glass was made, if indeed it was made in ancient Egypt. Similarly, we have no artistic representations of glass workers. So all our evidence comes from archaeology, and the majority of that evidence comes from the work done by Sir Flinders Petrie at Tel El Amarna in 1891 and 1892. Petrie had a great eye for technology and a great interest in trying to understand the everyday things of life and how they were made. As we heard yesterday, much of the technological information would then be worked on by Flaxman Spurrell and others to elucidate further what Petrie had found. But the credit must go to Petrie for really looking in detail and picking up things which seem on the face of it to be really quite odd and perhaps unimportant. Things like this, a quartz pebble stuck to a piece of potsherd with some frit material adhering to it. We'll come to what frit is in a moment. Here it is. A large lump of that frit material, which is always thought to be the partly reacted raw materials for glass manufacture. So silica in the form of sand or ground up quartz, perhaps from quartz pebbles like you just saw. A soda, kind of an alkali, which might come from natron or from plant ashes. And lime, again crushed and heated lime. These things were reacted together to make a frit material, and the reason that this is blue is that it's had a little bit of cobalt added to it to give it this rich blue colour. You can see that it's full of bubbles. Part of the reason why these things would be reacted together in the first place is to drive off gases such as carbon dioxide, which form during the heating process. which means that when you melt this to make glass, it should have no bubbles in it. You've already driven away the gases. He also found things like this, a cylindrical pottery vessel thrown on the wheel, very distinctive wheel marks on it. And he put all that information together to make what is probably one of the most famous technological reconstructions in Egyptology. The way that he believed glass was produced. The cylindrical vessels stand with their rims to the bottom and serve as the supports for fritting pans, in which the raw materials would be heated together, probably at temperatures around 850 or 900 degrees, raked together to form that frit material. He knows the shape of the vessel because that lump of frit that I showed you still preserves the profile of the interior of the vessel. You'll see also on here, or rather you won't, that there are no quartz pebbles. And yet, when you look at Petrie's account, he talks about the floors of the kilns perhaps being lined with quartz pebbles. So convincing was this reconstruction that it has appeared in almost every book on the history of glass making. And at least one paper talks about the kilns and furnaces which Petrie found at Amarna. But when you actually look at his account in detail, he's very explicit in saying that he didn't actually find any kilns or furnaces that he believed were associated with glass making, and his reconstruction is entirely based on hypothesis. It's a hypothesis, though, which has a good background. He's got the archaeological material, and he knew from medieval glassmaking texts from Europe that glassmaking was normally a two-stage operation. This heating together of the raw materials, the fritting process to make frit, which you would then grind up and melt, again, probably at temperatures around 850, 900 degrees to make glass. So you never had to take the temperature above, say, 900 or 950 degrees. And that's well within the range that we know is possible with an updraft kiln or furnace. In other words, one that has its fire at the bottom and uses the hot gases passing up through a perforated floor to actually make the material. So that ought to really be the end of the question. The Egyptians clearly did make glass, in Petrie's view. He's fairly explicit on that point, and it was very widely accepted for quite a long time. We know that glass appears in Egypt at around 1500 BC, and some of the most impressive pieces that we have are indeed early pieces, like this one from the reign of Thutmose III. Doesn't, however, mean that it was made in Egypt, because Petrie himself realized that glass was probably earlier elsewhere in the Near East, and that it was probably not an Egyptian invention. Throughout the 50s, 60s and 70s of the 20th century, people had been researching glass and trade, and in 1973 Oppenheim suggested something which Petrie himself had already postulated, that glassmakers were probably brought to Egypt during Thutmose III's campaigns to establish an industry within Egypt. However, because the Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence that comes from Tel el Amarna, include letters which talk about the import of glass, a large number of scholars started to take the view that, all right, glassmakers may have been brought into Egypt, but they probably only made vessels. They didn't actually make the raw glass. And perhaps all the raw glass had to be imported from the Near East. Those who took that view were initially supported by the discovery of a shipwreck off the Turkish coast at a place called Uluburun, from which came a number of glass ingots, most of them in deep blue glass, but there's also a number of turquoise blue glasses and one lavender glass. Early attempts to reconstruct where that Uluburun ship might have been going suggested that the glass ingots had probably been made up here in Canaan, and that they would have been imported into Egypt. So the view was taken quite widely that the Egyptians couldn't make their own glass, that Petrie had probably misinterpreted the evidence, and that, in fact, the Egyptians depended on the Near East for their glass sources. Interestingly enough, whilst saying that, virtually every book on the early history of glassmaking still used Petrie's diagram to illustrate how ancient people made glass, whilst saying, on the other hand, the ancient Egyptians couldn't make glass. They didn't have the technology. So the Egyptians didn't make their own glass then. But once again, it's perhaps a little bit more complicated than that. And what I was interested in trying to do in the 1990s was to reassess what Petrie had found and to try to give it some context, because although his excavation records and his publications are extremely useful, they are not necessarily detailed enough for us to understand the archaeological context of some of the finds. In fact, good though Petrie's records are, he doesn't actually tell us where any of the several glass and glazing works which he discovered were at Amarna. We know they're there, but that's all we know. They're not marked on his plan of 1894, and our best guess for their location is that they're probably in this area, which is marked as moles on the map. And by moles, he's referring to these clay molds which were used in the production of faience. I'm not going to talk at all about faience and faience manufacture today, except to say that it seems to have been an industry which was carried out at the same workshops as, or in close proximity to, glass manufacture. And it's not improbable that if Petrie and indeed Oppenheim are correct in their view that glassmakers were brought into Egypt to establish the industry, perhaps the people who they would be told to teach their craft to would have been the faience workers, because they also are people who are producing an artificial precious stone or semi-precious stone, mimicking lapis lazuli and turquoise in faience, and glass is perhaps being used in much the same way. So for the excavations in the 1990s, our best bet seemed to be to go to this moles area, which is located immediately to the south of the modern water tower at Tel El Amarna. Any of you who've been to the site will know it as one of the few tall features on the site. It's a very obvious place. And we began work in this area, which we've called 045-1, after its grid reference in the Amarna grid system. We very quickly realized that although we had to be in the right area for Petrie's moulds, this was not part of the site which had been excavated by him. So it's a new excavation. It begins with a cemetery phase, over which the industrial phase is built, and the industrial phase is then put out of action by the construction of a large building, 045-1, which has casemate walls which run across the features of the site, in particular the kilns and furnaces. And this is what the site looks like fully excavated. This is what we think is going on. We've got potting. There is in fact another potter's kiln just off screen. We have a potter's workshop, another kiln there. Faience manufacturing. You'll see that I've got this kiln in twice, because I like to hedge my bets. Very difficult to tell whether we're dealing with a structure for making faience or for making pottery, since they would have worked at similar temperatures. And then we've got these two rather odd things at the centre, which are much different in scale and construction to pottery kilns. And those are the things which Caroline Jackson from Sheffield University and I are regarding as being for glass production. Here they are. We have called them kilns. We think they're actually glass furnaces. They're working at high temperatures. And they look very different to the conventional pottery kilns that we know of from Amarna. Here's one of them starting to emerge. It has very thick walls, about 50 centimetres thick, built in a complicated brickwork pattern, whereas pottery kilns are usually only a single brick thickness and are built in a very simple way. Here, seen from above, you can see some of that complicated brickwork pattern running around it. And next to kiln 2, we have kiln 3, which not only shares the same brickwork pattern, but has this very thick layer of vitrification in it. We've called this a slag layer, which is actually a misnomer. Slag really refers to metallurgy. What this is the melted remains of the lining of the furnace. And just to give you your bearings again, here's the possible pottery and or faience kiln. We've got a couple of large furnaces here, our kilns 2 and 3, and up here there's a little working hearth, probably for softening glass, but we're not going to look at that. There is glass from the excavation. We've got pieces of glass lying around, not worked up into objects. In fact, we have almost no glass that has been worked up into objects from this site. That then begs the question, what are those two big furnaces at the centre of the site? When they came to light, we had long discussions about whether they might be for metallurgy, but there's no evidence of metals. Whether they might be for faience production, but again they seem large and unnecessarily complicated for that. Could they have been for the burning of lime, because lime is found around them? That again seems unlikely, and the evidence for pharaonic lime kilns is not is not good. So we were sort of driven back to the idea that perhaps these were for the production of glass. And we took the idea to the Association for the History of Glass when it met in the Netherlands in 1995, and everyone said you couldn't make glass in something that size, it's too big. Which is fair enough, except that no one has ever seen what the earliest glass furnaces look like. We have no idea what size they could or could not have been. So in 1996, we decided that we would reconstruct at full scale at Amarna one of these furnaces and see if you in fact could make glass using it. This is Hashkandil's best brickmaker, turning out bricks in pharaonic pattern. They are the same size as the ones from the excavation and pretty much of the same composition. And here we're starting to replicate that complicated brickwork pattern. We're 2 courses in, and you can see that we have 1 row of stretcher bricks with header bricks behind it. But the pattern changes as you make your way up the profile. So here we've got the lowest course with headers with stretchers behind, then stretchers with headers behind, then a solid row of stretcher bricks. It's a complicated way of building something. It's designed to withstand thermal stress, and it's designed to be as well insulated as possible. At least that's our interpretation of it. Here, built up to almost ground level, and you can see that we've put in a kind of chute. This is on the north side of the structure, and that's where we believe that the stoke hole would originally have been. Another course up, and we have put in 3 little shelves projecting into the furnace, because that's what we believe some of the slaggy areas in the furnace that we excavated might have been. This is some of our evidence. You can see here we've got projecting into the furnace, and indeed here areas of very vitrified mud, which is probably the vitrified mud brick and the kiln lining which has melted. And if you look here, you can see that we've also got a brick which is on a slope, suggesting that perhaps the top of the furnace might have been domed. We know from the excavation that it was plastered inside with mud plaster, because where it has not vitrified, we still have the plaster complete with fingerprints. And that's what we've done here. We've seen that sloping brick, which suggests that perhaps the upper part of the kiln would have had some kind of a dome over it. And that's further suggested when you look at the eastern side of the furnace, where, as you can see from the ruler, which is vertical, we've got the walls just starting to come in on us. And a little bit more evidence for what that superstructure must have looked like. Here we've got a brick with long stalactites of this melted slaggy material hanging from it. Those stalactites are hanging down vertically. But when you hold them so that they are vertical, the brick is at an angle. So the brick must have come out of a dome itself. So we think we have fairly good evidence for reconstructing something like this. We did eventually let Caroline out. It also tells us, incidentally, that if we've got our proportions of this structure correct, the person who was building the inside, or at least finishing off the inside of the dome, would have to be fairly small. I'm too wide at the shoulders to be able to get through the stoke hole. It needs someone fairly small to be able to do this. So it may have been a child or a small workman. And just over here in the background is the water tower. That's where the original excavation took place. So this is an experiment that's taking place, as it were, on its home territory and in an environment as close as we can get to the ancient environment. We've plastered over the dome of the furnace. We have no evidence for that. We don't have the outside of the dome surviving, but since its purpose is to retain as much heat as possible whilst being as strong as possible, it seemed to make good sense to cover it in a layer of plaster. Notice, by the way, that it doesn't look nearly so big when you see it like this as when you saw it in plan. And just to summarise, here it is with its corbelled dome. There's the stoke hole, there's one of the shelves, layer of plaster inside, and these very thick walls. The next thing to do was to actually get together the raw materials for making glass. We've already seen what they are, basically soda, lime and silica. There are lots of analyses of ancient Egyptian glasses. This is just one of them, but you can see it's, as you would expect, mostly sand, mostly silica. Amarna is in the desert. We're not exactly short of sand, but finding suitable sand is a different matter. If you look at most of the sand that's lying around on the surface of the site today, it's heavily contaminated with bits of mud brick because someone built a city there and it has gradually decayed, and we've got lots of admixed mud. So what we did was to take sand from one of the great wells at Amarna, which had sanded up in ancient times after the abandonment of the site, and it's fairly clean sand, mostly silica with some lime mixed amongst it. Then we come to the soda. Salima has already told us about natron, and you've had a chance to have a look and see some natron samples which she brought. It comes from the Wadi Natrun. It's used by Roman glassmakers in Egypt, and it may also, we now believe, be used by some New Kingdom glassmakers. However, the primary alkali used in ancient Egyptian glass seems to have been Salsola kali, or a related salt-loving halophytic plant, which would be harvested, dried, and burned to make ash. Unfortunately, I'm a lousy botanist, and though I'm told some of this does still grow in the area around Amarna, I've never seen it, let alone been able to collect any of it. So we substituted seaweed from the beach at Penarth in South Wales. Akhenaten's glassmakers, if such they were, probably didn't do this. It does, however, have the same properties as halophytic plants, and when you can dry it, not easy in South Wales, and set fire to it, you can make a suitable ash from it. This is the seaweed ash. It's been burned in a garden incinerator, collected, and we then crushed it with a mortar and pestle into a fine powder, picking out anything that was much more than a millimetre or so across, and was uncrushable, which is not as difficult as it sounds, actually. And then in good Delia Smith fashion, we mixed it at 2 parts of ash to 1 part of sand by weight. And it's important that this is done by weight, not by volume. That's our glass-making mixture. And I've been talking about it being a soda-lime-silica mixture. We have not added any lime to it. And the reason that we've not done that is because lime is naturally present in the sand from Amarna. And we wondered whether, if the Egyptians could make glass, whether they might be selecting particular sands which were naturally rich in lime. And that might be a reason for establishing industries in particular places. And Lucas had already identified the fact that the Amarna sand is rich in lime. What we did add, and which isn't on here, is a tiny pinch, literally a finger pinch of cobalt to give a blue colour to whatever it was that we produced. Our mixture was transferred into a series of crucibles. We used a wide circular crucible, about 15 or 16 centimetres across, and a taller, rather beaker-like crucible to see which would perform best. We had 3 shells, which you've already seen, one here, and one at the back, which is where our crucibles are standing. Here's our stoke hole. We've made a little temporary wall next to the stoke hole, which helps to funnel the north wind straight into the firebox. We've slightly narrowed our original opening on the top, not only because Caroline doesn't need to stick her head out of it, but because you don't need a great wide opening to let the smoke out, and then we wanted to keep in as much heat as possible. All the fuel that we used was weighed according to type. We used jereed, in other words palm, 68 kilograms, pine, 85 kilograms, and off-cut timber, which was, at the time of our experiment, unidentified. It was bought from a local furniture factory, 227 kilograms of that. Now, that turns out not to be a native Egyptian wood, so there is a substitution there. Total of 380 kilograms was actually used by us. We had much more stocked up because we had no idea how much we would eventually use. Here, looking through the stoke hole, you can see one of our, perhaps can't actually, it's not quite dark enough in here, one of our crucibles sitting on the shelf. This was the one which we thought had the best chance of making glass. We've got thermocouples, high temperature measuring devices around the kiln so we can record the temperature as we go along. And we've got various things in there as controls. Firing went very steadily, and we were able to get a temperature of about 1150 degrees without too much difficulty. I say without too much difficulty. 1000 is usually reckoned to be about the top temperature for an updraft kiln, but you can push them to 11 or 1150 by carefully stoking them. More than that, a kiln or furnace made out of mud bricks will actually melt. You've seen all that slag, which is the lining of the furnace and some of the bricks starting to melt. If you go above 1150, the whole lot will actually vitrify and melt completely. So this is about the top temperature that you can reach with a kiln of this sort. And you see we're able to carry along at 1100, 1150 quite nicely until we have a sudden temperature drop. That's what in experimental archaeology is known as panic, because at that point the shelf fell off, the one that you were just looking at, and we opened the other, one of the other ports, one of the other shelf arrangements to see what was going on. We found when we opened that we had been able to produce some frit material, which wasn't unexpected. We should certainly have been able to produce frit by that temperature, but as you see, it's not turned to glass. In this other crucible, we have a very nice clear glass, but unfortunately it's not one that we could get all that excited about, because it was already glass when it went in. This was the remains of a broken beer bottle left over by Ian Shaw's expedition. There was no shortage of that raw material, oddly enough. It was put in there as a control because we knew that that should melt at around 850. So it was there as a check on our thermocouples. So we knew that we were getting the right sort of temperatures, things were working okay, but we hadn't actually produced glass. On the upside, no more shelves fell off, so we continued our firing. At the end of the firing, we blocked the stoke hole. These ports, this one which we've already opened, the one at the back has fallen off, and this one which we've not seen at all, were already sealed because we didn't want any draft getting into the furnace. And we left it overnight to cool down. We examined the frit that was produced. I've got a piece of this here if any of you want to have a look at it afterwards. It's very like the kind of material that Petrie found and which he believed was the first stage in making glass. Next morning, very early, we went out and opened some of these ports to see what we'd eventually produced. And this is one of our wide, shallow crucibles. You see it's got the slaggy material sticking to it. Some of the kiln lining has melted, just like on the original furnace. And it's got this shiny stuff, which is rather difficult to make out in this photograph, inside. In a rather better photograph, it is actually glass. And I have a piece of the ingot here if any of you want to have a look at it. It is virtually free of bubbles. It has almost no unreacted material in it. It's a perfectly decent glass, and it's also chemically stable. It's been sitting around now in my office for about 9-10 years, and it hasn't deteriorated at all. It's interesting because not only does it suggest that these furnaces could have been used to produce glass, but that they could have been used to produce glass in a different way than that suggested by Petrie. There is no deliberate fritting stage where you rake the raw materials together at about 850 or 900, let them cool, take them out, grind them down, put them back, reheat them. It appears that you can make glass in one stage. Which takes us back again to Ulla Barun and another look at those glass ingots. You can see that the ingots have corrugations on this top surface. They are, to all intents and purposes, like finger marks or finger grooves. And that's actually what they are. Now, it's unlikely that anyone stuck their hand into the hot glass to give it a quick stir around. Or if they did, they probably did it only once. These top surfaces are the bottom surfaces of the ingots, and the reason that they have that pattern on them is that they are the casts from the inside of wheel-thrown vessels like this. You can just about see at the bottom here, there's quite a deep finger groove there. There's another just about visible there and there. They must have come out of a cylindrical pot, a bit like these. And I wondered when I saw those National Geographic photographs whether not only might they have come out of pots like these, but perhaps they came out of these pots. So I compared some of our drawings of the Amarna cylindrical vessels from the site with the publications of some of the glass ingots from Ullabarun, and you can see that they're quite a similar size and diameter. They look in 2 dimensions as though they would fit into the mould. They do, in fact, fit into the moulds really rather well. There's about a 2 millimetre discrepancy there, and I'm not too worried about that, because the only mould that this particular ingot would fit into is the one that it was made in. These things are handmade. There is a variability of perhaps up to a centimetre or so in their diameter. So it's not surprising that it doesn't fit perfectly, but it's pretty good. And when we got an actual cast from the Ullabarun project, that also fits. So we know that they fit in 3 dimensions. It's not just that it happens to fit rather nicely in 2 dimensions. So the experiment then suggests that even if he's wrong in detail, Petrie must be right in practice, and it proves that the Egyptians made glass. Well, no, it doesn't, actually. The experiment shows only that the furnaces could have been used for glass making, but it doesn't prove it. And that's one thing which we have to, of course, be very aware of with experimental archaeology. Just as Coles suggested, and as we heard from our last speaker, it lends probability to the argument that the Egyptians may have been able to make glass. You have to see the experiment in context, along with the excavated evidence and the scientific evidence. The scientific evidence, the laboratory studies, have been very useful in this respect, in that when Petrie's frit material was examined at Oxford, it was found that the frit doesn't match chemically with the finished glass. So the pieces of frit that he found are not necessarily the first stage in glass making as he thought. They might have been added to glass as a colorant, but it's not stage 1 of glass making. They haven't got enough lime in them. So that bit of evidence seems to be at odds with his original interpretation. Also, examination by Caroline and I on the Ullabarun ingots and work by Dr. Brill at the Corning Museum has shown that they are coloured with cobalt, which probably came from the Karga and Dakhla Oasis region, some of that alum which Salima was telling us about yesterday. So at least the colorant appears to be Egyptian. And more recently, Caroline and I have done work on some of the trace elements in the glass, which confirms that the glass as a whole is Egyptian made. So it does appear that the ancient Egyptians could make glass by the time of Akhenaten. They didn't invent it, but they could make it. They didn't have to depend on imports from abroad for the raw material. They could have made it using local raw materials. It could be made in one operation. There's no need to necessarily apply that medieval model with a two-stage process. The furnaces will reach temperatures suitable for the manufacture of glass, and they're not too big. But perhaps most importantly, the argument that the Egyptians, by the time of Akhenaten, could make their own glass does not depend on the experimental archaeology. That is just one part of the process of trying to understand what may have gone on. If those furnaces ultimately prove to be something completely different, it no longer affects the argument for the Egyptians being able to make glass. We know that from the chemistry. The furnace experiment has been extremely useful to us in understanding some of the heating regimes, because they clearly must have used furnaces. It's been helpful in raising new questions, which has sent us back to look at some of the original material which Petrie excavated, and which has helped us with our ongoing excavation, when it was ongoing, to develop new questions. So it's played a very important role, but our conclusions are not dependent only on the archaeological experiment. And finally, just to thank those who have given us money or provided support. Grateful to all of these for their help and advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Are you happy to take questions?
Yes. No.
Yes.
I have a question about the bottom of the furnace and the shelves on the side. It looks like in the excavations that those were broken edges. Do you have further questions about how deep the bottom was, or what was in the bottom of the furnace, and where the slag walls seem to stop relative to the benches?
Yeah, a question about where the so-called slag on the walls of the furnace stops, and why we may have broken edges to some of that slag material, and what's going on at the bottom of the furnace. The very bottom of the furnace isn't lined with anything at all. It's simply burnt sand. And in fact, a skull from the cemetery phase actually came out from the bottom of the furnace when we were going through it. So it's just a burned sandy base to the furnace. The slag material, judging by that brick, must have run from the top of the dome down to just below ground level. Below that, we've got plaster still with fingerprints in, and one side of the furnace, which must have been the hottest side, which in this case was the west side, is very much more highly vitrified. You're quite right, it does look as though areas of that slag have broken away. When the photograph that you saw was taken, we've already lifted out pieces that were already detached. They'd cracked through. What seems to have happened, to judge by the underside of some of that slag material, is that a large mound of ash and partly burned material had built up in the furnace. The slaggy material had sort of flowed in places on top of that and was sitting on it, supported by it. Over time, perhaps when they were building the casemates and so on and walking about, some of that had then broken away, which is why you've got broken edges to the slag.
Have you found any information for the trading of glass from, Mesopotamia or anything since you've been doing this project?
In the sense of actual pieces of glass, you mean?
For trading, one piece of glass or 4 ingots traded to Egypt interchangeable?
No, we've got no evidence for ingots being traded to Egypt. We only actually have one, what I would think of as a primary glass ingot from the whole of Egypt that I'm aware of. It's now in the Luxor Museum, and it's a red glass ingot which originally came from Camtia, so it's later. It's a Ramesside piece. However, the blue glass ingots from the Ullabrun shipwreck were made in Egypt, and they're on their way out. Where they were probably going, I think, is to the Mycenaean world, where so far there is no evidence for the making of primary glass, but they are working glass to make jewellery elements and so on. So we think that maybe they were going there. The Ullabrun ship had certainly already been to Egypt, because as well as the glass ingots, there's rather conveniently, there's a gold ring of Nefertiti from the wreck as well. So it has certainly already been there. There is evidence from the Amarna letters of glass being imported into Egypt. I'm not saying that this never happened, but that's not the same thing as saying the Egyptians couldn't make their own glass, which is what has come to be the argument. I suppose a parallel would be that at least until recently we could make cars in Britain, but we still imported from abroad. Having the technology and always using the technology isn't the same thing, and they may well have been importing particular colours of glass which they had difficulty making themselves. Yellow possibly, I suspect, may have been one of the colours that they might have imported from abroad.